The silence in the clapboard church in Prosperity Creek was as heavy and suffocating as the August heat. It was a silence made of judgment, curiosity, and the dry rustle of a woman's Sunday dress. Arthur Sterling stood at the altar, a man carved from the Montana Territory itself, his shoulders broad enough to block the light from the single stained glass window. He was 45, with a face weathered by sun and worry, and his hands, resting on the rail, were thick with the kind of calluses that come from building an empire of cattle and land. He did not look at the preacher. He did not look at the townspeople packed into the pews. His gaze was fixed forward, as unyielding as the horizon on his own vast ranch. Beside him, a space was held for the bride. When the side door opened, every head turned. She was 18 years old and could not have weighed more than 100 pounds. Her name was May, a name that felt foreign and fragile on the dusty air of the territory. She was brought in not by a father, but by Mr. Abernathy, the dry goods merchant who had brokered the arrangement. He held her arm with a proprietor's grip, his face a mask of nervous satisfaction. The deal was done. A debt was settled. May's wedding dress was not white. It was a simple, dark blue traveling frock, the same one she had worn for the 3-week journey from San Francisco. It was clean but rumpled, a testament to a life packed into a single trunk. She kept her eyes downcast, her focus on the worn floorboards, as if she could trace a path back the way she came. Her hair was a river of black silk, coiled neatly at the nape of her neck, and her face was pale and still. She did not look like a bride. She looked like a captive. The preacher, a young man with more piety than experience, fumbled with his book. His voice, when it finally emerged, was thin and reedy. He spoke of union, of partnership, of the sacred bonds of matrimony. The words fell into the silence and vanished. To Arthur, it was a transaction. He needed a wife to manage his home, a presence to quell the whispers that a man of his wealth and age remained alone. He had been promised someone quiet, compliant, and hard-working. He had paid a handsome sum to settle a merchant's debt in California, and in return he received this girl. He had not expected her to be quite so young, or so small. She seemed a child playing dress-up in an adult's tragedy. When the time came for the vows, the preacher looked at May with a helpless expression. She spoke almost no English. Mr. Abernathy had taught her 2 words on the wagon ride from the railhead. The preacher prompted her. "I do." Her voice was barely a whisper, a sound like a bird's feather brushing against glass. "I do." Arthur's reply was a low rumble, a sound the town knew well. It was the voice of a man who bought cattle by the thousand and sold them by the trainload. "I do." He placed a simple gold band on her finger. It was too large. It slid down to her knuckle and sat there, a loose and heavy shackle. There was no kiss. Arthur simply turned, took her arm with a touch that was firm but not unkind, and led her down the aisle. The townspeople watched them pass, their faces a mixture of pity for the girl and a grim sort of respect for the baron who always got what he wanted. They saw a powerful man and his new possession. But as May passed the last pew, she lifted her head for just a moment, and her eyes met those of the blacksmith's wife. In that fleeting glance, there was no fear. There was a profound and bottomless weariness, but beneath it, a flicker of something hard and unbroken. It was a look that the blacksmith's wife would remember for a long time. The ride to the Sterling Ranch was 5 miles of dust and silence. Arthur's wagon was sturdy, his horses strong. He handled the reins with an easy, practiced competence, his attention on the road ahead. May sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, the oversized ring a glint of alien gold against her skin. The sun beat down, and the vast, empty landscape stretched out in every direction, a sea of brown grass and distant, hazy mountains. To a girl from a crowded port city, it must have looked like the end of the world. When they arrived, the ranch house was larger than any building in Prosperity Creek. It was a 2-story timber structure with a wide porch, built to withstand harsh winters and the loneliness of the plains. A few cottonwood trees, coaxed to life by a nearby creek, offered the only shade. A man came out to meet them, his face lean and suspicious. "This is Jed, my foreman," Arthur said, his voice flat. He made no move to introduce May. He simply helped her down from the wagon, his large hand briefly enveloping her elbow. Jed's eyes flickered over May, taking in her small stature and Chinese features with a look that mingled contempt and disbelief. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near her feet. "Got the north herd moved to the summer pasture, boss. Couple of the new calves look a bit off, though. Scours, maybe." "I'll look at 'em in the morning," Arthur said, his tone dismissing both the foreman and the topic. He gestured toward the house. "The housekeeper quit 2 weeks ago. You'll have to manage." He led her inside. The house was a man's space, filled with the smell of leather, wood smoke, and stale coffee. Heavy furniture stood draped in dust cloths. The kitchen was clean but unused, the pantry stocked with tins and sacks of flour. He showed her to a room upstairs. It was a simple room with a bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the endless, rolling land. Her small trunk had been placed at the foot of the bed. "This is yours," he said. He stood in the doorway, seeming to fill the entire frame. He was a man of few words, and he had reached his limit. He did not know what to say to this silent, foreign girl who was now his wife. He had fulfilled his part of the bargain. He expected her to fulfill hers. He turned to leave, but then paused. "There is food in the pantry. I eat at sundown." He left her there, closing the door behind him. May stood motionless in the center of the room for a long time. The silence of the house pressed in on her. She walked to the window and looked out. There were no other houses, no other people in sight. Just the vast, indifferent land, a corral with dozens of horses, and the distant shape of cattle grazing. She was utterly, completely alone. She slipped the gold ring off her finger, held it in her palm for a moment, then slid it back on. It was loose, but it was there. A fact. A cage. She did not yet know that the man who had put it there was watching her from the barn, his expression unreadable, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The first week was a study in silence and observation. May moved through the big, empty house like a ghost, cleaning away the dust and neglect. She learned the geography of the kitchen, the heft of the cast-iron pans, the rhythm of the well pump. She cooked for Arthur each evening, simple meals of beans, bacon, and bread. She would set his plate at the head of the long dining table, then retreat to the kitchen to eat her own small portion alone. He never complimented the food, but he always cleaned his plate. Arthur watched her. He was a man who understood livestock better than people. He judged an animal by its actions, its instincts, its quiet resilience. He saw that her hands, though small, were never idle. He saw the way she organized the pantry, arranging the tins and sacks with a logic he couldn't grasp, but which made everything easier to find. He saw her mend one of his shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She was efficient, silent, and contained. She was exactly what he had been promised, but her profound stillness unnerved him. It felt less like compliance and more like a deeply held reserve, a wall he could not see but constantly felt. The tension on the ranch was not just in the house. Jed, the foreman, made his disdain for May clear. He and the other 4 ranch hands would stop talking when she came near the cookhouse to gather supplies. They called her the China doll when they thought she couldn't hear, their voices laced with a casual cruelty. They saw her as a strange pet the boss had acquired, a decorative but useless addition to the harsh, masculine world of the ranch. The crisis with the calves worsened. It wasn't just scours. A half-dozen of the youngest animals were dead, and more were sickening. They were weak, lethargic, and refused to nurse. Arthur and Jed had tried all the usual remedies, turpentine, castor oil, even a dose of whiskey. Nothing worked. The sickness was spreading, threatening a significant portion of the year's new stock. Arthur's face grew harder, the lines around his eyes deeper. A cattleman's wealth was in his herd, and his was dying. One afternoon, May was tending to a small vegetable patch she had started behind the house, coaxing life from the dry soil. She saw Arthur and Jed near the sick pen, standing over a calf that was struggling to breathe. She watched them for a long time, her expression impassive. She had seen a sickness like this before, in the pigs her village raised. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked quietly toward the pen. As she approached, Jed turned, his face twisting into a scowl. "What do you want? This ain't no place for you." May ignored him. Her eyes were on the water trough inside the pen. She pointed a slender finger at it. "Water," she said, one of the few English words she knew. "They got water," Jed snapped. "They just ain't drinking it." Arthur said nothing, but he watched her. There was an intensity in her gaze that he had not seen before. She walked to the fence, her eyes scanning the ground around the trough. She then pointed again, not at the water itself, but at a cluster of dark green, leafy weeds growing near the base where the trough had a slow leak, keeping the ground damp. "This," she said, her voice clear. She made a gesture to her own mouth, then shook her head violently and made a sick, choking motion. Jed laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "It's just pigweed, girl. Cows eat it all the time." "Not this," she insisted, her dark eyes flashing with a sudden fire. She looked directly at Arthur, a clear challenge in her gaze. Arthur looked from her to the weed, then to the sick calves. He was a practical man, not a botanist, but he was also a man on the verge of losing a great deal of money. He had seen that look in her eyes once before, in the church. The look of someone who knew something others did not. He made a decision. "Jed, clean out the trough and move it," he commanded. "Tear all of that weed out. All of it. Then bring fresh water from the main well." Jed stared at him, his mouth agape. "Boss, you ain't going to listen to her, are you? It's just a weed." "Do it," Arthur said, his voice low and dangerous. It was the voice that made men obey without question. Jed scowled, but he turned to do as he was told, muttering under his breath. Arthur continued to watch May. She went to the creek bed that ran behind the house, gathering something from the banks. She returned with her apron full of willow bark and the leaves of a plant he didn't recognize. In the kitchen she boiled them down, filling the house with a sharp medicinal scent. She carried the resulting bitter-smelling tea out in a bucket. She approached the weakest calf, the one they all thought would be dead by morning. She dipped a clean rag in the liquid and patiently, gently, squeezed the fluid into the corner of the animal's mouth. The calf struggled weakly at first, then lay still, swallowing. She did this for over an hour, moving from one sick animal to the next, her movements calm and deliberate. Jed and the other hands watched from a distance, their arms crossed, smirking. Arthur watched from the porch, saying nothing. He stayed there until the sun went down, a silent sentinel. By the next morning, 2 things had happened. The weakest calf, the one May had spent the most time with, was standing on wobbly legs, and none of the other calves were any worse. Over the next 3 days, under her continued care, every single sick animal began to recover. The scours stopped, their appetites returned. The crisis was over. The silence at the ranch changed. Jed no longer sneered openly, though he still avoided looking at her. The other men gave her a wide berth, their mockery replaced by a wary, grudging respect. They didn't understand what she had done, but they understood results. Calves that were worth $20 a head were now alive instead of dead. It was a language they all spoke. Arthur understood it too. That evening, for the first time, he spoke to her during dinner. She had served him his meal and was about to retreat to the kitchen as usual. "Stay," he said. It wasn't a request. She paused, then took a seat at the far end of the long table, her back straight, her hands in her lap. The distance between them seemed as vast as the prairie outside. He gestured with his fork toward her plate, which she had not yet touched. "You should eat." He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a contract or a household fixture, but as the person who had just saved a part of his livelihood with a handful of weeds and boiled bark. "How did you know?" he asked. May looked down at her hands. She struggled for the words, her English still a barrier of sharp, unfamiliar stones. "My father," she began, then paused. She pointed to herself. "In my home, not cows, pigs, same sick, same plant." He nodded slowly, processing this. She had not performed a miracle. She had applied knowledge. It was a skill, earned and practiced. It was work. He understood work. Later that night, driven by a new and unsettling curiosity, he went into her room while she was outside. He did not mean to pry, but he felt a compelling need to understand the woman who now lived in his house. Her trunk was not locked. He opened it. Inside, beneath her few spare items of clothing, were several books. They were filled with Chinese characters, but they were not books of words. They were books of pictures. He lifted one out. The paper was thin, the binding hand-stitched. Page after page was filled with exquisite, detailed drawings of plants. Leaves, stems, flowers, and roots were rendered with the precision of a scientist. Next to each drawing were columns of elegant characters. He could not read a single one, but he recognized the plant from the sick pen, and he recognized the willow tree. He sat on the edge of her bed, turning the pages, a profound sense of dislocation washing over him. He had married a mystery. He thought he had acquired a simple, uneducated girl to solve a domestic problem. He was beginning to suspect that the person of substance in their marriage was not him. The fragile peace on the Sterling Ranch, born of May's quiet competence, was shattered by the arrival of Marcus Thorne. Thorne was Arthur's only real rival in the territory, a man whose ambition was matched only by his lack of scruples. He owned the adjacent spread, and for years he and Arthur had been locked in a cold war of fence lines, water rights, and grazing land. Thorne arrived one morning with two of his men, riding right up to the porch as if he owned the place. He was a handsome man in a polished, predatory way, with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Sterling," he boomed, swinging down from his horse. "Heard you had some trouble with your calves. A shame." His eyes slid past Arthur to where May stood in the doorway, a basket of laundry in her hands. His smile widened. "And this must be the new addition to the household. I confess I'm surprised. Didn't take you for a man with such exotic tastes." Arthur's face hardened. "State your business, Thorne." "Business? Just a neighborly visit." Thorne's gaze lingered on May, insolent and appraising. "I just bought the Henderson plot." "The one that borders your eastern pasture. The one with the only reliable spring for miles." A cold stillness settled over the porch. That spring fed the creek that was the lifeblood of Arthur's summer grazing lands. Without it, he'd have to move thousands of cattle at great expense and risk. "That land wasn't for sale," Arthur said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Everything's for sale, Sterling, if the price is right," Thorne said cheerfully. "I'll be fencing it off next week, but, being a good neighbor, I'm willing to discuss leasing you access. For a price, of course." It was a declaration of war. Thorne was trying to strangle his operation, to bleed him dry. Arthur knew it, and Thorne knew he knew it. After a few more minutes of veiled threats disguised as pleasantries, Thorne and his men rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and malice in their wake. That evening, the atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken tension. Arthur barely touched his food. He sat staring into the middle distance, the muscles in his jaw working. For the first time, May saw a crack in his formidable composure. She saw the worry of a man whose entire world was under threat. A few days later, the first disaster struck. A section of Arthur's northern fence was cut, and nearly 200 head of cattle wandered off. It took Arthur, Jed, and all the hands 2 full days of hard riding to round them up. They returned exhausted and grim-faced. It was clearly sabotage. Then, the water in the main creek began to taste strange. Horses that drank from it grew listless. Arthur, fearing the worst, rode the entire length of the creek on his property, searching for the source. He found nothing. The water flowed clear from the boundary of his land. The problem was somewhere upstream, on the land Thorne now controlled. He was trapped. Thorne could slowly poison his herd, ruin him by 1,000 cuts, and there was little Arthur could do legally without proof. The territorial marshal was 100 miles away and wouldn't act on a rancher's suspicion. One night, unable to sleep, Arthur was in his study, poring over maps of his property, trying to find a solution that wasn't there. He was so consumed by his thoughts that he didn't hear May enter. She placed a cup of tea on the desk beside him. He looked up, surprised. She didn't retreat. Instead, she pointed to the map. "Thorne," she said, her pronunciation careful. Then she pointed to the drawing of the creek. She made the same sick gesture she had with the calves. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "I know." She then did something that startled him. She picked up a pencil, and on a scrap piece of paper she began to draw. Her strokes were quick and certain. She drew the creek, the fence line, and the spring on Thorne's new property. Then, above the spring, she drew a shape. A small circle with lines radiating from it, and next to it, the unmistakable shape of a dead animal. She looked at him, her eyes wide and serious, and tapped the drawing of the dead animal, then the spring. The implication was clear. She believed Thorne hadn't just poisoned the water with a chemical, but with a diseased carcass, a more insidious and lasting form of contamination. It was a common enough tactic in bitter range wars, but one that was almost impossible to prove without trespassing. She wasn't finished. She traced a line on his map with her finger, a line that followed a series of dry gullies and low ridges, a difficult path that led to a point on the far side of Thorne's property, well away from his ranch house. It was a long and treacherous route, but it would allow someone to approach the spring undetected. She looked at him and he understood. It was a plan, a reckless, dangerous plan. He couldn't go himself. He would be recognized and shot for trespassing. He couldn't send Jed or his men. They were loyal but clumsy. A single rider, moving at night, might stand a chance. He looked at her, this small, silent woman who had lived in his house for less than 2 months. She was proposing a course of action that could get someone killed. He saw no fear in her face, only a fierce, protective loyalty that he had done nothing to earn. "No," he said, the word coming out harsher than he intended. "It's too dangerous." She met his gaze and did not flinch. She picked up the pencil again and drew a simple sketch of a house. His house. Then she drew a stick figure of a man and a smaller one of a woman. She drew a fence around them. Then she drew another figure outside the fence. Thorn, with a firebrand about to set it all ablaze. She tapped the drawing of the woman, then pointed to herself. Then she tapped the difficult path on the map. Her meaning was unmistakable. This was her home now, too, and she would not stand by and watch it burn. It was a choice that cost her something. In that moment, she shed the last of her passivity. She was no longer a victim of circumstance, but an active participant in the fight for their survival. It was also a choice that cost Arthur his certainty. He had built his world on the principle of self-reliance, of trusting no one but himself. Now he was faced with a truth he could not ignore. He could not solve this problem alone. He needed her. He needed her mind, her courage, and her plan. He looked from the map to her determined face, and for the second time, he found himself utterly speechless. He slowly, deliberately folded the map and put it in his pocket. "Show me the path again," he said. 3 months later, the first snows of winter dusted the high peaks of the mountains, and the air in Prosperity Creek had a clean, sharp bite. The land was resting, and so was the Sterling Ranch. Marcus Thorne was gone. Acting on May's plan, Arthur had taken the long way around at night, not to the spring itself, but to a high ridge overlooking it. From there, with a spyglass, he had watched for 2 nights until he saw Thorne's men dumping a diseased sheep carcass into the water source. He had ridden straight to the territorial capital, not to the marshal, but to the land deeds office. Thorne, it turned out, had been over-leveraged for years. His grand purchase of the Henderson plot had been his final, desperate gamble. Armed with the knowledge of Thorne's sabotage and the threat of a public scandal that would ruin his credit entirely, Arthur had approached Thorne's creditors. He didn't destroy Thorne with violence, but with finance. He bought Thorne's debt, foreclosed on his land, and absorbed the entire operation into his own. Thorne had left the territory in disgrace, a ruined man. The change on the Sterling Ranch was profound. It was in the way Jed now nodded to May in the mornings, a gesture of clear respect. It was in the way the ranch hands brought her small gifts from town, a length of ribbon, a bag of horehound candy. It was in the herb garden she had cultivated near the kitchen, a patch of green that defied the coming frost, filled with plants for healing and for flavor. The house was no longer just Arthur's shelter. It was a shared space, warmed by the smell of baking bread and drying herbs. One evening Arthur sat by the fire in his study, not with ledgers, but with one of May's books of drawings open on his lap. May sat in a chair nearby, mending a pair of his thick leather gloves. The silence between them was no longer empty or tense. It was a comfortable, settled thing, a quiet testament to a partnership forged in crisis. He pointed to one of the drawings, a delicate, star-shaped flower. "What is this one called?" he asked. She looked over, a small smile touching her lips. She said a word in her own language, a sound like soft bells. Then she searched for the English. "It is for sleep, for peace." He nodded, looking at the intricate drawing, at the careful strokes of the pen. He thought of the day they were married in the church, of the silent, frightened girl with the oversized ring. He had seen her as a solution to a problem, a simple transaction. He had been a fool. He had not acquired a servant. He had found a partner whose strength was quieter, but no less profound than his own. He closed the book gently. "May," he said, the name feeling natural for the first time. "Thank you." She looked up from her sewing, her dark eyes meeting his across the small space. She didn't ask what he was thanking her for. For saving the calves, for saving the ranch, for turning his cold house into a home. She knew. She simply inclined her head in a gesture of acknowledgement, a gesture that spoke of shared burdens and shared victories. Arthur Sterling, the great cattle baron, had built an empire with his own 2 hands. He had faced down droughts, blizzards, and ruthless men. But he learned the most important lesson of his life from an 18-year-old girl who spoke in pictures and weeds. He learned that a home is not the land you own or the house you build. It is the quiet respect you earn and the unexpected peace you find in the presence of another. The gold ring on her finger, which she now wore on a chain around her neck, was no longer a shackle. It was just a piece of metal. The real bond between them had been forged not by a preacher's words, but by courage, wisdom, and the shared silence of a winter evening. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.